The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine layer of grit that coated the soul as much as the skin. Jedediah felt it in his throat as he scanned the market, the oppressive summer sun beating down on the raw timber of the town. It was a place of loud noises and quiet judgments, and he preferred the company of his cornfields. But supplies were low, and the silence of his farm could sometimes grow too loud, pressing in on him until the memory of his wife's laughter was a faint and painful echo. He was turning to leave, a sack of flour slung over one shoulder, when he saw her. She was tucked away between a stack of empty chicken crates and a barrel leaking sour mash, a small, still figure in a world of harsh movement. Her dress was the color of a faded sunset, a pale, dusty pink silk that was torn at the hem and stained with the grime of the road. A Cheong Sam, he thought he'd heard them called, a dress not meant for this land of denim and leather. She was barefoot, her feet bruised and dirty, tucked beneath her as she sat on the splintered planks. Her head was bowed, a curtain of straight black hair hiding her face, but it was the profound stillness of her that snagged his attention. The townsfolk gave her a wide berth, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a ghost, or worse, a contagion. Whispers followed in their wake, sharp and cruel as burrs. Jedediah stopped, his boots rooted to the spot. He saw not just a foreigner, abandoned and alone, but a reflection of his own isolation, magnified and made raw. The town had never truly accepted him, the quiet farmer who kept to himself after the fever took his Sarah. He was a fixture, a necessity, but not one of them. This woman, she was something else entirely. She was an aberration they could openly despise. Sheriff Barton saw him looking and ambled over, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Just keep walking, Jedediah. Not our business." But it felt like his business. It felt like the only real thing happening under the searing blue sky. He watched as a dog sniffed near her, and she flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, the only sign she was alive at all. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't be the kind of man who saw a soul so utterly adrift and chose the comfort of ignorance. He adjusted the sack on his shoulder and began walking toward her, each step a quiet rebellion against the town's collective heartlessness. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her further. He set the flour sack down with a soft thud and uncorked his canteen. He knelt, the worn denim of his trousers protesting, and held it out. He said nothing, letting the simple offering speak for itself. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, hesitantly, her head lifted. Her face was smudged with dirt, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, but it was her eyes that held him. They were deep and dark and filled with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to drink the very light from the day. She looked at the canteen, then at his face, her gaze searching for the trap. He kept his expression neutral, his hand steady. Finally, her own small, trembling hand reached out and took it. Her fingers were like ice against his calloused skin, a strange contrast in the suffocating heat. She drank, long and deep, the water spilling down her chin and darkening the tattered silk of her dress. When she was done, she held it out to him, her eyes not quite meeting his, a silent transaction of need and aid completed. He took it and stood, but he didn't leave. From his pocket he pulled the small loaf of bread he'd bought for his own supper. He broke it in half and offered her a piece. This time she didn't hesitate. She took the bread with both hands as if it were a precious jewel and began to eat with a desperate, controlled hunger. Sheriff Barton was watching from across the street, his face a mask of disapproval. "I'm telling you, Jedediah," he called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "She's trouble. Best leave her be." Jedediah didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge the sheriff or the prying eyes of the other townsfolk. His world had narrowed to this small patch of dusty ground, to this woman who had nothing. He knew what trouble was. Trouble was a failed crop, a long winter, an empty house. This wasn't trouble. This was a human being. When she finished the bread, she looked up at him again, a question in her eyes. What now? He didn't have an answer. He only knew he couldn't leave her here, an offering to the town's cruelty. Come on, he said, his voice rough from disuse. He picked up his flour sack and gestured down the road leading out of town, toward the rolling hills where his farm lay hidden. She stared at him, then at the hostile faces around them, and slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. The journey to his farm was a silent pilgrimage. The sun beat down and the dust from the road rose in a fine cloud around them, clinging to their clothes and hair. He walked a few paces ahead, giving her space, but he was acutely aware of her presence behind him. He could hear the soft, pained whisper of her bare feet on the hard-packed earth. Each step was a testament to a resilience he could only guess at. He thought about offering to carry her, but the rigid set of her shoulders, the fierce pride in the way she held her head, told him she would refuse. She was following him, a stranger, into an unknown future, but she was not surrendering. His farm was a simple, lonely place. A small, weathered cabin, a sturdy barn, and fields that stretched out toward the horizon, stitched together with fences he'd mended 100 times. It was his sanctuary and his prison. As they approached, his dog, a scruffy mutt named Buck, came bounding out, barking a welcome before skidding to a halt at the sight of the stranger. The woman froze, her body tensing. "It's all right," Jedediah said, his voice gentle. "He's harmless." He gestured for her to wait on the porch, a shaded space with a worn wooden bench. She obeyed without a word, sinking onto the bench and drawing her legs up as if trying to make herself smaller. He went inside. The cabin was sparse, containing only the essentials of a solitary life. Sarah's touch was still there, in the faded curtains she had sewn, in the smooth, worn wood of the rocking chair by the cold hearth. For a moment, bringing another woman into this space felt like a betrayal, but the house had been empty of life for too long. He filled a basin with cool water from the pump and brought it out with a clean rag. He set it on the porch floor in front of her. "For your feet," he said, and then retreated into the cabin to give her privacy. He busied himself making a simple stew, the familiar motions of chopping vegetables and stirring the pot a comfort. He didn't know her story, didn't know the name of the man who had left her in that town, but he knew the language of pain. He had seen it in the mirror every morning for the past 3 years. That evening, he ladled the stew into 2 bowls. He took one for himself and set the other on the porch bench, a good distance from where she sat. He retreated to the steps, eating his meal in the growing twilight. She watched him for a long time before she finally picked up her own bowl and began to eat. That night, he laid out a clean blanket and a pillow on the cot in his main room. He took another blanket for himself and went to sleep in the hayloft of the barn. He left the cabin door unlocked. It was the only way he knew how to offer trust. Days bled into a week, each one a mirror of the last. A rhythm established itself, quiet and unspoken. He would rise before the sun, do his chores, and leave a portion of his breakfast on the porch. She would emerge sometime after he had gone to the fields, a silent wraith moving through his home. He gave her space, a wide circle of solitude that he hoped felt like safety. He never entered the cabin while she was inside. The barn became his domain, the scent of hay and animals a familiar comfort. He began to see small changes, tiny footprints of her existence. One morning he noticed the patch of wild herbs near the porch, which he had long neglected, had been carefully weeded. The mint and thyme, once choked and struggling, now stood straight and green. Another afternoon he came in from the fields to find one of his work shirts, the one with the long tear in the sleeve, folded neatly on the porch railing. The tear had been mended with a series of tiny, perfect stitches, a thread of dark blue against the faded brown fabric. He ran his thumb over the seam, marveling at the neatness of it. It was a language he was beginning to understand, a conversation held in actions instead of words. He found himself thinking of Sarah, of her small, capable hands. The thought brought a pang of guilt, followed by a wave of something else, something softer. He wasn't replacing her. He was simply not alone anymore. The silence of the farm was different now. It was no longer an empty void, but a shared space, filled with the presence of another person. He decided she needed shoes. Her feet were still raw, though she never complained. He went into the small chest at the foot of his bed, the one that held Sarah's things. He had not opened it since the day he had packed her belongings away, unable to bear the sight of them. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and old memories rose to meet him. He pushed aside a delicate lace shawl and a book of poetry, his fingers finding what he was looking for, a pair of sturdy leather work boots. They were scuffed and worn, shaped by Sarah's feet, but they were strong. He placed the boots on the porch in the early morning light, next to her breakfast bowl. He said nothing, just left them there as an offering. He spent the day mending a fence on the far side of his property, his mind churning. He felt a strange mix of hope and anxiety. When he returned at dusk, weary and covered in dust, he saw her sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset. She was wearing the boots. They were far too big for her, the tops lolling around her slender ankles, but she wore them with a quiet dignity. Her own bruised feet were finally protected. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was the first crack of light in a long, dark winter of the soul. His supplies were running low again, and the trip to town could no longer be avoided. He felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He was no longer just Jedediah, the grieving widower who kept to himself. Now he was the man who had taken in the foreign woman. He was a story, a subject of gossip and speculation. When he entered the general store, the usual murmur of conversation died down. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, polished the counter with a cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't meet Jedediah's eyes. "Flour, salt, coffee," Jedediah said, his voice flat. Mr. Gable gathered the items without a word. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. A few men loitering by the stove watched him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Keeping her out there at your place, are you, Jed?" one of them asked, a sneer in his voice. Jedediah didn't reply. He paid for his goods, his jaw tight. As he stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, Sheriff Barton was waiting for him. The lawman's face was grim. "We need to talk, Jedediah." He led him to the side of the building, away from prying ears. "People are talking," Barton began, his voice low. "They're saying all sorts of things. They're scared. A woman like that, showing up out of nowhere, it ain't natural." "There's nothing unnatural about her," Jedediah said, his own voice dangerously quiet. "She was alone. She needed help." "Help is one thing. Harboring her is another. You're bringing trouble on yourself, on this town. Some of the men, they get ideas. You know how it is." Jedediah knew. He knew the simmering anger and fear that lay just beneath the surface of a town like this, how easily it could be ignited against someone who was different. He looked at the sheriff, at this man who was supposed to uphold the law, and saw only a man bowing to the ugliest instincts of the crowd. The conversation, the cold shoulders, the palpable hostility. It didn't weaken his resolve. It forged it into something hard and unyielding. Her safety was no longer just an act of charity. It had become his purpose, a line drawn in the dust. Before leaving town, he made one last stop. He went to the seamstress's shop and bought a length of sturdy cotton fabric. It was a deep, calming blue, the color of the sky just before dawn. He also bought needles and a spool of dark thread. He didn't know if she would accept it or what she would do with it, but it felt important. It was a silent offering, a way of saying that the tattered pink dress did not have to be her whole story. It was a chance to create something new, something strong, something that belonged in this world she had been so violently thrust into. That night the sky broke open. A summer storm rolled in from the plains, a furious onslaught of wind, rain, and thunder that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Jedediah was in the barn checking on the animals when the first clap of thunder cracked like a whip overhead. He thought of her, alone in the house. He hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but another violent boom, closer this time, decided for him. He ran through the deluge, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, and pushed open the cabin door. The main room was empty. The cot he had prepared for her was untouched. A lantern on the kitchen table cast a flickering golden light, and he found her there. She was huddled on the floor in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her body trembling with each successive peal of thunder. The big, ill-fitting boots were on the floor beside her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to go far beyond the storm. It was a primal fear, one born of a deeper trauma. He didn't go to her, didn't touch her. He knew that a comforting hand could feel like a threat. Instead, he pulled out a chair from the small kitchen table and sat down, creating a safe distance between them. He just sat there in the flickering light, a quiet, steady presence against the chaos outside. The silence stretched, broken only by the storm's fury and her ragged breaths. He decided to fill it. He began to talk, his voice low and even, not looking at her but at the worn grain of the wooden table. "My wife, Sarah," he began, the name feeling strange and rusty on his tongue. "She loved storms. She'd stand on the porch and watch the lightning, said it made her feel alive." He spoke of her, of the life they had built in this small cabin, of the illness that had come swiftly and stolen her away. He spoke of the silence she had left behind, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply laying his own broken pieces on the table, showing her that she was not the only one who carried scars. The storm raged on, and he kept talking, his words a small anchor in the tempest. When the thunder finally began to recede, moving off into the distance, a fragile quiet settled over the room. It was then that she spoke for the first time. Her voice was a bare whisper, hoarse from disuse. "They left me." 3 simple words, but they held the weight of 1,000 betrayals. They were the key to the locked room of her past. They told him everything he needed to know. He finally looked at her, and she met his gaze. Her eyes were still full of pain, but the terror had subsided, replaced by a flicker of something else. Connection. The storm had passed, both outside and in. The empty silence that had defined their existence was gone. Now, it was a shared silence, filled with the unspoken understanding of 2 people who had both been left behind. After the storm, the fragile barrier between them dissolved. A new, tentative softness began to weave itself into the fabric of their days. She started emerging from the cabin earlier, sometimes meeting his eyes with a shy nod as he headed for the fields. He found he looked for it, that small acknowledgement that had come to feel like a sunrise. One morning, he came out to find her standing by the fence, looking out at the rows of corn. She held a hoe in her hands, tentatively. He walked over, expecting her to retreat, but she stood her ground. "The weeds," she said, her voice still quiet but clearer now. "They choke the roots." He showed her how to hold the tool, how to break the soil without damaging the young stalks. He was struck by the strength in her slender frame, the focused determination in her movements. They worked side by side that day, a silent rhythm building between them. The scrape of the hose, the whisper of the wind through the corn, the warmth of the sun on their backs. It was a new kind of conversation, one that felt more honest than words. He found himself watching her, noticing the small details he had missed before. The way she would pause to push a stray strand of hair from her face, the quiet grace in her posture, the intensity of her focus. He was seeing not just the survivor, but the woman. That evening, on his way back from the fields, he spotted a cluster of wild daisies growing by the creek. On an impulse, he picked one. It was a simple, humble flower, but its bright yellow center seemed to hold the warmth of the day. He left it on the kitchen table, next to the blue fabric he had bought in town. He felt foolish afterward, a grown man leaving flowers like a schoolboy. But the next morning, the daisy was in a glass jar of water, its face turned toward the window, and he saw that she had unrolled the fabric, its deep blue a pool of color on the pale wood. A warmth bloomed in his chest, as bright and surprising as the flower itself. He started talking to her more, not about the past, but about the present. He told her the names of the birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. He explained the patterns of the seasons on this land, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. She listened, her dark eyes attentive, and sometimes she would reply, telling him the name of a plant in her own language, or describing a dish made from the vegetables in their garden. Their separate worlds began to overlap, creating a small, shared space of understanding, a fragile garden they were tending together. The fragile peace of their new existence was shattered one evening just after sundown. The sound came first, a low rumble of hoofbeats and slurred, angry voices growing steadily louder. Jedediah was on the porch, cleaning a piece of tack, and he straightened instantly, his body going rigid. He knew who it was. The trouble Sheriff Barton had warned him about had finally arrived at his door. He told Leanne, who was inside, to stay put and lock the door. He didn't reach for his rifle, not yet. He would not be the first to show violence. 4 men from town reined in their horses just beyond his fence line, their shapes dark silhouettes against the dying light. They were drunk, their courage liquid and cheap. "Jedediah!" one of them yelled, his voice thick with malice. "We know you got her in there. Send that foreign witch out." Another laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped at the quiet evening air. "This is a decent town. We don't want her kind here." Jedediah walked down the porch steps and stood his ground in the yard, his hands loose at his sides. He was just a man, standing in front of his home, but his stillness was a challenge. He was a wall, and they would not pass. "This is my property," he said, his voice calm and level, carrying easily in the stillness. "You're not welcome here. Go home." "We ain't going nowhere until you give her up," the first man shouted, dismounting and stumbling toward the fence. "She belongs with her own." Suddenly the cabin door opened. Leanne stepped out into the lamplight spilling from the doorway. She wasn't wearing the tattered pink dress anymore. She had made a simple, functional tunic from the blue fabric, and in the dim light she looked strong, rooted to the land. She didn't hide behind him. She walked to his side, her small hand finding the sleeve of his shirt and gripping it tightly. Her presence was not a plea for help. It was a declaration. "We stand together." The men faltered. Their drunken rage was meant for a cowering victim, a frightened shadow. They didn't know what to do with this silent, united front. They saw not a farmer and his ward, but a man and a woman protecting their home. Jedediah's gaze never left them. He was no fighter, no gunslinger, but there was a dangerous resolve in his eyes, the look of a man who had already lost everything once and would die before he lost it again. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by the sour taste of their own cowardice. With a few more muttered curses, they retreated, mounting their horses and riding off into the darkness, their threats fading into the chirping of the crickets. Jedediah didn't relax until the sound of their horses had completely disappeared. He felt Leanne's grip on his arm loosen. He turned to look at her, her face illuminated by the lantern light. In her eyes he saw not fear, but a fierce, quiet strength that mirrored his own. They had faced the town's ugliness together, and they had won. The story of that night rippled through the town, changing shape with each telling, but the core of it remained the same. Jedediah hadn't flinched, and the Chinese woman had stood right beside him. The town's opinion, a slow and ponderous beast, began to shift. The loudest voices of prejudice were shamed into a sullen silence, while others began to feel a grudging respect. The next time Jedediah went to town for supplies, the silence in the general store was different. It was not hostile, but contemplative. As he was leaving, Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, who had previously looked through him, came out from the back. She silently placed a small basket of fresh eggs on the counter beside his flour sack. "For your trouble," she mumbled, not quite meeting his eye. It was an apology, a peace offering, a small crack in the wall of their judgment. The farm settled into a new rhythm, one of deep and abiding peace. The bond between them, forged in silence and solidified in defiance, now deepened into something warm and gentle. It was in the small, everyday moments that their affection grew. It was in the way she started leaving a cup of hot coffee for him on the porch rail every morning, and the way he started saving the most perfect vegetables from the garden for her. It was a language of care, spoken without a single word of love. One evening, as the autumn sun bled across the horizon in strokes of orange and purple, Jedediah was hammering a loose post back into the fence line. He was so focused on his work, he didn't hear her approach. "Jedediah." Her voice was soft. He turned. She was holding a tin cup of cool water. She had been wearing Sarah's old boots for months now, and they no longer looked too big. They looked like they belonged to her, worn and softened, a part of her story. He reached for the cup, and his calloused, dirt-stained fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, gentle as a spark, passed between them. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the abandoned woman from the market, but Leanne. He saw the resilience in her eyes, the quiet intelligence in her expression, the gentle curve of her mouth. He said her name, the first time he had spoken it aloud to her. "Leanne." She met his gaze, and for the first time since he had known her, a genuine smile reached her eyes, lighting them from within. It was a smile of trust, of safety, of a new beginning. "Jedediah," she replied, her voice clear and steady. The simple exchange of their names was more intimate than any embrace, a quiet acknowledgment of the life they were building together, piece by piece. Months turned into a year. The harshness of that first summer softened into a golden autumn, which gave way to a quiet, snow-dusted winter, and then bloomed again into a vibrant spring. The farm, once a place of solitary grief for Jedediah, was now alive with a shared purpose. The corn grew taller, the garden yielded more than ever before, and the silence in the cabin was no longer empty, but comfortable and full. The town, having witnessed the quiet, unwavering strength of their bond, had finally laid its judgment to rest. They were no longer a spectacle, but simply a part of the landscape, like the rolling hills and the endless sky. Jedediah and Leanne were Jedediah and Leanne. There was no need for any other explanation. One evening, as the last light of day painted the clouds in shades of soft rose, they sat together on the porch steps, as they often did. Leanne wore a simple dress sewn from the deep blue fabric, a color that brought out the warmth in her skin. On her feet were the worn leather boots, now a perfect fit. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. They watched the fireflies begin to flicker in the tall grass, their tiny lanterns dancing in the twilight. They had built their world not with grand declarations, but with small, consistent acts of kindness. A mended shirt, a cup of water, a shared meal, a flower in a jar, a silent presence during a storm, standing together against the darkness. It was a testament, not to a dramatic rescue, but to the slow, patient healing of two broken souls who had found a way to piece each other back together. Jedediah felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The gnawing emptiness that had hollowed him out for years was gone, filled with a quiet, steady warmth that emanated from the woman sitting beside him. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the wooden step. Her fingers, no longer trembling and cold as they had been on that first day, curled around his, strong and sure. They fit together as if they had been made for it. He looked out at the fields they now tended together, at the small, sturdy house that was no longer just his, but theirs. It was home. And the town, they had not been moved to tears by a single heroic act. They had been moved by the steady, undeniable truth of what they saw over the passing seasons, the powerful, transformative grace of a simple, quiet love.